She is pushed into the tent, the flaps snapping shut behind her like the final curtain on a life she once knew. Oil lamps gutter in the close air. Men in uniforms crowd the small space, shadows of rank and hunger. A standard leans against the pole, its brass catching the light. Her hands are bare now. The necklace that marked her lineage has been wrenched away and lies on the dirt, a pale glint amid mud and straw. Someone speaks her name aloud, not as a call, but as a verdict. The commander repeats it slow, as if closing a ledger. Then he says another name over her, an official label. The word is small and ordinary, spoil. The transformation is immediate, ritualized, absolute. This scene is not a single documented episode to be boxed and filed. It is a composite, drawn from patterns that recur across sources and material remains, from legal fragments and soldiers boasting, from inscriptions and the silences in between. It represents how, in the shadow of victory, Roman armies converted people into property, and in particular how noblewomen, those whose social worth had once been measured in kinship, marriage ties, and public position, were turned into instruments of domination. What happened inside tents like this one was not private in the sense of being outside politics. It was public power, exercised in a private setting, where ritual, force, and law met to erase names and reassign bodies. We will unpack this carefully. I will trace the legal and cultural frameworks that made such scenes possible, describe the practical mechanics of capture and transfer, reconstruct the ritualized processing that stripped women of former status, and follow the thread into daily life under captivity, the surveillance, labor, and sexual violence that often followed. Along the way, I will introduce vignettes of individual women, composite figures whose small acts of resistance survive only in the margins. A carved message on a pottery shard, a whispered name passed under blankets, a child hidden in the folds of a garment. Where the documentary record is thin or ambiguous, I will say so. That uncertainty is part of the story. Where specific practices are attested, I will indicate sources so the claims can be checked and expanded in production research. CT, Livy, Polybius, Roman legal fragments, archaeological reports, indefinido where noted. If you want histories that look past marble and into the shadows of conquest, subscribe. Roman armies marched with a particular logic. Victory meant not only territory and tribute, but also human gain. Captives were counted among the spoils. This was a norm across many ancient societies. Rome's institutions and rhetoric gave it distinctive form. Soldiers expected reward for risk. Commanders expected authority commensurate with their victories. Law, custom, and the exigencies of supply chains intersected to place civilians, women, children, elders, within a system that turned them into objects of disposal, exchange, or household labor. Legally, the status of captives could be complex. Wartime custom and specific decrees often placed prisoners under the dominion of the army or of victorious commanders. Some captives were sold into slavery, others were assigned to households as servants or concubines. Still others were kept as hostages to ensure compliance from a subdued population. The apportionment of captives was both economic and symbolic. The general who retained a high-born woman in his household asserted dominion not only over her person, but over her family's honor. Roman literature and law, when they speak to the subject, do so in the language of property, tribute, and reward. Cite Roman law fragments, inscriptions, scholars on Roman slavery. Yet the law that recorded ownership seldom recorded the interior life of the person at the center of that record. Practices varied by time and place. In some cases, captives were marched back to Italy and sold in markets. In others, they were kept near the theater of war, integrated into camp households. Certain forms of sexual exploitation was structured under labels like concubinage or the keeping of captives as household women, terms that obscured the coercive conditions in which these relationships existed. There were also rituals and ceremonies that marked a captive's transition into a new, subordinated legal and social status. These rituals could be public, serving as a demonstration of victory to troops and locals alike. In other instances, they took place behind tent flaps, sealed to the gaze of the many but no less formal in function. How did people become the kind of prize that could be handed from one man to another? The wartime mechanics was sometimes brutal and sometimes bureaucratic. During sieges, the fall of a city could produce a flood of civilians who were sorted. The able-bodied might be pressed into labor. Aristocrats and leading families could be taken hostage, paraded, or taken to the commander for decision. Artisans might be relocated to supply the victors. Outside formal sieges, bands of soldiers foraging through the countryside might seize women along with goods. Tributes and levies could include people, hostages delivered by local elites to guarantee tax or troop contributions. Debt and clientage also played a role in some contexts. Indebted families might lose members into servitude. Host communities might hand over suspected troublemakers to placate a garrison. The logistics of transfer mattered. Captives had to be fed, guarded, and moved. Armies were mobile, and moving a group of defenseless persons required resources, guards, carts, routes that avoided hostile zones. Where transport to a distant market or garrison was impractical, captives might be kept locally and dispersed among officers' households. Sometimes women were assigned en masse to camp households to perform domestic labor, cooking, washing, caregiving, work integral to the army's operation, but rendered invisible in narratives of campaign glory. The movement of captives was therefore both an economic decision and a political performance. Who you kept and who you let go signaled power. The initial processing of captives in camp, what we might call the tenting ritual, was a ritual of erasure. The image we began with, the commander pronouncing a new status, is representative. In many accounts of ancient warfare, the transformation of the captive into a thing or into someone else follows certain steps: separation from community, removal of distinguishing dress, the assignment of a label or status, and finally, the public or semi-public presentation to the authority who will claim them. Each of these steps served a purpose. Removing a woman's dress or jewelry stripped her of markers of rank and identity. Renaming cut family ties and legal claims. Public presentation asserted the victor's right and dampened resistance through humiliation and spectacle. These acts were not random cruelty. They were functional, organized to break social bonds and to signal to both captives and witnesses that the old order had been superseded. There is variation and debate among scholars about the fine details of some of these practices. For instance, the shaving of captives' heads appears in some sources and in material culture from neighboring cultures, used as a sign of disgrace or control. But whether it was a routine Roman practice in every theater is indefinido. Where shaving is attested, historians read it as both symbolic and practical. It erased personal identity and made escape more difficult. Where it is not clearly attested, comparable measures, forced dress changes, branding, or the removal of personal tokens serve similar functions. It is crucial to be cautious. The absence of explicit mention in a surviving text does not prove absence in practice, and the presence in one province does not prove universality. For the purposes of understanding the tent scene, the essential point is this: the processing contained symbolic acts designed to dissolve previous social personhood and to remold the captive into a category useful to the victors. Consider a composite vignette to make this concrete. Composite. A noblewoman from a provincial city, call her Livia for convenience, though that name is a placeholder, had been present in public life. She had supervised household rites, worn distinctive pins and a braided coiffure that marked a family lineage, and moved within a network of kin and patrons. When her city fell after a week-long siege, she was captured while attempting to hide in a storeroom with other women. Soldiers pried open the door. She surrendered without any claim of military resistance. Yet in the chaos, she was separated from her husband and children. That night she was escorted to the general's encampment. Before she left, a neighbor pressed a small clay token into her palm. The name of her father scratched into the surface, an object to carry a trace of identity if nothing else. At the command tent the next day, Livia's personal ornaments were taken. Her hair was combed out and rearranged into a plain style. Whether a specific practice of shaving was applied in her case is unclear, indefinido, but her hairstyle no longer signaled her social standing. A scribe was called, an inventory was recorded. A tablet or a wax tag might have been attached to her person, bearing a brief legal label. Captiva, serva, concubina, each term with specific legal implications. The commander pronounced his decision. If he declared her spoil to be kept in his household, she would be moved within the camp's domestic arrangements. If he ordered her sold, she would be sent to market. If he decided to retain her as a concubine, a form of intimate but unfree relationship, that decision carried long-term consequences for her autonomy and her offspring's legal status. The recorded language can be dry, but these labels reshaped lives. To be listed as captiva could mean perpetual servitude. To be designated concubina could mean sexual access under duress framed as private reward. To be sold meant exposure to the auctioneer's gaze and the atomization of social ties. The register of the process, the scribe, the tag, the ledger, made violence legible to the institution, even as it made the woman's humanity invisible. The tent was the liminal space where public authority and private coercion met. The general's personal tent was more than a bedroom, it was a small court. Orders were given, testimonies taken, punishments administered, rewards dispensed. Within its canvas walls, decisions that would alter the legal status and intimate lives of captives were finalized. The tent provided a veneer of secrecy. It allowed the display of power to those who needed to see it, officers, close allies, without witnesses that could complicate or condemn the act. The ritual of presentation also functioned as a performance to the troops. The commander's control was visible, tangible. The army's honor as distributor of spoils was reaffirmed. What happened after the initial presentation could differ widely, but it often involved long-term forms of domination that combined economic exploitation with sexual subordination. One common arrangement in Roman sources is the household incorporation of women into the service of a commander or his officers. In that context, a captive might perform domestic tasks, tend children, repair clothing, or perform other labor needed by the household. These forms of labor were central to how an army sustained itself in foreign territory. Yet because many of these roles were gendered and invisible, they rarely made it into triumphant narratives of battles and borders. Instead, they appear in legal texts, in passing comments by ancient writers, and in the archaeological residue of domestic spaces. Sexual violence, when it appears in the record, is often obfuscated by terminology. Ancient authors sometimes frame non-consensual sexual contact as a reward of war or subsume it under the language of concubinage and marriage by conquest. Modern readers must be careful. Terms like concubine and household woman imply a legal category in Roman practice, but they do not neutralize the violence of the circumstances in which these relationships were forged. To name what occurred as sexual violence is therefore both historically and ethically required. In many cases, women had little effective choice. Consenting under threat of violence is not consent. Sexual access could be used as currency, offered to soldiers as a form of incentive or withheld as punishment. Commanders might claim a right to select those they desired as part of the spoils distribution, the very logic that placed women under the power of a man who had just conquered their city. Inspection was part of the process. Clinical-sounding accounts in some sources, medical treatises, administrative notices, or soldiers' letters, reference examinations or the allocation of captives to households based on age, physical condition, or skills. Sit indefinido, possible references to camp instructions or later commentators. These assessments could slide swiftly from administrative sorting into checks on sexual availability. Again, in describing these things, we step carefully. The evidence is often fragmentary and mediated by authors who had their own agendas. Where practices are attested directly, I will note sources. Where the record is sparse, I mark the claim indefinido and reconstruct plausible mechanisms that would fit the available evidence and the logic of the institution. Resistance to this apparatus was real, though rarely recorded in the grand histories. Small acts of defiance, refusing to adopt a new name, hiding personal tokens, communicating secret messages, are the thin threads by which historians sometimes pull at a larger fabric of resistance. Consider another composite. Composite. A woman known here as Alia was taken as part of a troop's foraging raid in a rural province. She was kept in the household tent of a centurion who maintained a small retinue of enslaved persons. Alia, who could neither read nor write, learned to fashion tiny marks in the soft clay of a cooking pot. When the pot was later broken, the shard showed a pattern of incised lines that an acquaintance later read as the initial letters of her father's name. That shard is a fictional reconstruction, but mirrors countless archaeological finds where broken domestic ceramics bear otherwise inexplicable graffiti or marks. Citi, archaeological reports of graffiti on pottery, indefinido for direct parallels. These small engravings, these whispered names become acts of witness. The person who carves a letter risks punishment, but the act affirms existence. Some captives sought escape, others sought bargaining power. Families surrendered hostages in hopes of protecting broader kinship groups. Mothers negotiated small freedoms in exchange for labor. Where captives bore children to their captors, those children's status created complex social realities. A child born in a commander's household could be recognized and helped to bridge two worlds, but the violence that produced such unions cast shadow over any claim of affection. The institutional reproduction of the system, taking captives who then birthed children within Roman-dominated households, ensured that domination could persist across generations, blending coercion with the legitimizing force of lineage. The rhetoric used to justify these practices was multi-layered. Contemporary commendations of generals and soldiers emphasize valor and duty. Public monuments celebrate conquest, and triumphal imagery often erases the human costs that underpin it. Within military circles, the distribution of spoils, including people, was framed as a reward for service. Authors who recorded these moments could treat them as normative, yet other voices, already marginalized in the sources, registered discomfort or critique. Philosophers, some legal commentators, and later moralists occasionally condemn excesses. Epigraphic evidence, funerary inscriptions, petitions, legal petitions from freeborn citizens, reveals a more nuanced social memory that includes grievances and claims for restitution. CT, inscriptions, legal petitions, indefinido for specific cases. One of the most chilling aspects of the tent ritual is what it does to names. In many cultures, names are not mere labels, but bonds that connect a person to family, memory, and civic life. Naming someone anew severs those bonds. In Roman accounts, we sometimes find that captives are given designations that attach them to their new masters. the formulaic addition of the owner's name or household designation to a person's identity. This was not simply bureaucratic, it remapped kinship. For noble women whose names recorded net worth, obligations, and honor, enforced renaming was a social death. The erasure extends beyond personal identity to public memory. Monuments of conquest rarely mention those who were taken. Triumphs list victories and territories, but omit lists of the living who were affected. Histories focus on generals and strategy. They leave the people who were moved like chess pieces in a footnote of logistics. Even when an ancient writer does record that women were taken, the remark is usually terse. The consequences remain unexamined. The tent, then, becomes a metaphor for the hiding of cruelty, a place where crucial decisions are made out of the sun, then hoisted into the light as the spoils of a victorious state. How do we get beyond the silence? Part of the answer lies in piecing together marginalia, documents that were not meant to be histories, private letters, legal petitions, household accounts, and archaeological traces. Another part is comparative, looking at neighboring cultures and periods to identify patterns of practice and logic. This comparative method must be used cautiously. Similarities do not prove identity of practice. Yet when multiple independent strands of evidence point in the same direction, a pattern of household incorporation, a practice of public presentation, legal designations that equate captives with property, the composite picture is compelling. But the sources are vexing. Much of what we would like to know, the interior psychology of a woman in a tent, the whispered bargains, the exact slogan used by a commando, escapes the surviving record. The record that remains is mediated by gendered priorities of ancient authors, by the selective preservation of official documents, and by the archaeological record's inability to capture spoken exchanges. This means that reconstruction requires a careful moral discipline to insist on the reality of harm without inventing lurid detail to fill gaps. It also means paying attention to the small things that do survive. A ledger entry that states 20 captives distributed among officers, a law that regulates the sale of prisoners, a funerary inscription that mentions a child born to a foreign mother in a Roman household. These fragments, when read together, establish institutional patterns even if they cannot give the full portrait of any individual's interior life. CIT legal fragments, inscriptions, archaeological syntheses. The tent ritual, the stripping of ornaments, the assigning of labels, these are procedural steps. They are where institutional logic meets human lives. The tent does its work quietly. It turns a person into a category. It creates orders and obligations that can survive for years. It is also where the seeds of resistance are sown, because the same close quarters that enable coercion also allow small acts of concealment and witness, carved initials on pottery, coins hidden in seams, whispered songs taught to children. The next section will follow those threads into the daily and intimate regimes that captives endured. The surveillance, the levy, the sexual coercion, and the survival strategies they developed. It will also look at the legal categories that shape possibilities for redress and the limits of those remedies. Before we move on, consider the image of the tent again. Think of it not only as a physical place, but as a mechanism, an institutional node where victory became property. The tent is where a commander could make a private decision with public consequences. It is where the state's power over bodies could be exercised with the intimacy of a household decision and the force of an army behind it. What was utterly repulsive in such moments was not only the immediate act of taking, but the systematic structures that rendered taking ordinary. We turn now to how captives were managed once the dust of presentation settled. The records that survive attest to a spectrum of fates. Some were sold and dispersed, some were kept within camp households, others were used as bargaining chips in larger political maneuvers. Each path had its own regime of control. In the next vignette, we see a household where authority is enforced through daily surveillance and ritual checks on freedom, where even small resistances carry heavy risk. In the household tent, the rhythm was not heroic but domestic, and that intimacy made the domination all the more effective. The centurion's matron supervised a small staff of enslaved cooks and washerwomen. A brazier smoked in the corner. A child slept in a sling beneath the bench. Into this ordinary scene, the new captive was folded like an inconvenient piece of furniture. She was given a simple bedroll, a crude tunic, a bowl. Routine, then discipline. Even when violence did not present a spectacle, it organized daily life. Surveillance became a form of governance. Officers stationed sentries at the entrances to the inner tents. Household slaves were instructed to report on any remark that might signal dissent. A woman's movements were no longer her own. Errands required permission, visits from outsiders were forbidden, and any attempt to reclaim former social contacts could be punished as insubordination or treachery. The household ledger, what food was allotted, which tasks were assigned, even the time she rose and slept, mapped out a schedule that left little room for privacy. Where legal codes spoke of captives' statuses, the camp's written records and private notes translated those statuses into everyday commands. Seat, Roman legal fragments, household accounts, indefinido for specific camp manuals. Work was gendered and relentless. Domestic labor, preparing bread, mending garments, drawing water, was essential to the army's functioning. A captive woman might be tasked with weaving, laundering the tunics of soldiers, preparing spiced stews for the commander's table, or tending to infants and wounded men. These tasks, framed as necessary service, also functioned as vector points for control. Being needed reduced the likelihood of outright killing or selling, but it also entrenched dependency and normalized subordination. The labor was visible in the archaeological record, where domestic areas in military camps show repeated patterns of wear, consistent with textile production, food preparation, and childcare. Zeit Archaeological Camp Reports. Indefinido for direct associations to captive labor. Sexual coercion threaded through these routines without always being named. In some households, a captive might become attached to a commander or officer in a relationship recorded with neutral language, concubinage, for instance, that blurred the lines between intimacy and coercion. In other cases, sexual access was transactional. Soldiers were rewarded with favors, and commanders used the promise or threat of sexual privilege as a tool to extract labor, obedience, or silence. Ancient authors sometimes describe such arrangements in euphemistic or normative terms. Modern historians must parse those accounts carefully to recognize the coercive context. Consent, in a setting structured by threat and dependency, becomes a fragile and unreliable category. To call the outcome sexual violence is to acknowledge the power asymmetry that made genuine choice impossible. Sitia, literary sources, modern scholarship on concubinage, indefinido where evidence is sparse. Inspections were another instrument. In some accounts, captives underwent assessments that read like inventory checks: age, physical condition, skills. Such lists could determine whether a woman was to be assigned to household tasks, presented for sale, or retained for the commander's purposes. The language of these documents, clinical and matter-of-fact, cloaked the moral weight of what was being evaluated. In a few cases, medical writers and military correspondences hint at procedures to assess the reproductive potential of captives, reflecting an institutional interest in children as a form of future labor or integration. Cite, medical treatises, military notes, indefinito for specific practices. When institutional records reduced bodies to categories and potentialities, they also reduced people to instruments of policy. Punishment was a tool designed to deter both individual resistance and collective unrest. Escape attempts might result in beating, sale to harsher owners, or exposure to remote, deadly labor. Public punishments operated as warnings. A captive who resisted could be executed or displayed in some manner that reinforced the camp's authority. At the same time, commanders balanced cruelty with calculation. Extreme misuse of captives could provoke unrest among local populations or damage the army's supply chain of labor. Thus, punishment was often calibrated, enough to intimidate, not so much as to undermine usefulness. Sources that survive, epigraphic records of legal cases, anecdotal moralizing literature, occasional letters, indicate both the existence of punitive measures and the ways in which they were justified as necessary to maintain discipline. Cite inscriptions, legal petitions, moral philosophers, indefinito where specific instances are lacking. The presence of children introduced further complications. A woman who bore a child to a Roman officer created a new web of legal and emotional entanglement. Under Roman law, children born into a household often assumed the status of their mother at birth, yet the father's acknowledgement or lack thereof could alter trajectories. Some offspring were claimed and raised within the household, sometimes achieving a degree of integration. Others were neglected or sold. These children were living legacies of violence and assimilation, biological markers of conquest that could, in some cases, become mechanisms of long-term domination. Epigraphic evidence does occasionally note the presence of children of foreign mother, signaling that these circumstances were recognized and socially visible, even if they rarely became celebrated. Cite inscriptions recording mixed parentage, indefinido specifics. What escaped records most often, however, was interiority, the small decisions a woman made each day to keep herself mentally intact. One common thread across the fragmentary evidence is concealment of names, of objects, of memories. A necklace hidden beneath a tunic, a small coin sewn into a hem, a fold of cloth preserved for a child. These acts did not overturn the system, but they disrupted the totalizing aim of erasure. The act of remembering, of telling a name to someone trusted, of drawing a mark on a pot, all functioned as resistance. Composite. In one household, a woman we will call Julia kept a scrap of linen with a woven motif unique to her paternal family. Each night she smoothed it against her breast and hummed a lullaby her mother had sung. A servant less bound to the centurion's scrutiny, a muleteer's daughter who had been spared sale, learned the melody and started humming it in the kitchen when Julia passed by. These small recognitions sustained a social link that the camp intended to sever. Years later, when Julia's child was petitioned for freedom by a relative who had survived elsewhere, that song was one of the few things witnesses could testify about as proof of connection to a pre-war family. Cite petition examples, archive-like documents, indefinido for specific ties. This kind of testimony, fragile, oral, and rarely recorded, was nonetheless a lifeline. Covert communication adapted to material constraints. Carvings on pottery, initials scratched into tent stakes, marks on the inside of a wooden bowl. Such traces survive sporadically across archaeological contexts, and, when they do, they open a window into an otherwise silent life. These marks are rarely explicit narratives. They are fragments. Yet they are eloquent in their silence. A single carved letter can say, "I existed." They are acts of defiance because they confront institutional silence with personal witness. Formal legal recourse existed but was limited. Freeborn citizens could petition magistrates for restitution or to protest the seizure of family members. Some legal avenues allowed for the recovery of property, the contestation of unlawful enslavement, or the assertion of citizenship rights. However, the wartime environment complicated such processes. Proving status, freeborn versus enslaved, legitimate marriage versus coerced relation, was difficult in the aftermath of conflict. Documents could be lost, witnesses dispersed, the machinery of justice could be distant or indifferent. In some instances, petitions recorded in municipal archives reveal the slow and uncertain path of seeking redress. Hearings that took years, rulings subject to local power, and outcomes that often favored those with institutional access. These petitions, when they appear, remind us that the law was not monolithic. It could be invoked by victims or their kin, even as it often failed to provide timely or adequate remedy. CETA municipal petitions, legal case fragments, indefinido specifics. Resistance could be collective as well as individual. Captives sometimes coordinated plans with local sympathizers, vendors who smuggled messages, servants who turned a blind eye, soldiers who harbored remorse. Organized escapes were risky and rare, but when they occurred, they could have ripple effects, reprisals, crackdowns, changes to how captives were guarded. Some commanders, anxious to minimize trouble, altered their practices in response to unrest. These adaptive responses suggest that domination was not total. It was contested, negotiated, and occasionally overturned. The historical record and the absence of a comprehensive archive means we must look to small fragments and interdisciplinary inference to reconstruct these dynamics. Let us pause to examine a composite case that gathers these strands: capture, tent ritual, household subjection, subtle resistance, and an ambiguous end that will serve as our climax. It is composite, drawn from patterns in varied provinces rather than a single documented narrative. Composite case. A noblewoman from a coastal city, call her Marcia, witnessed her town's walls breached after a week of fighting. She fled with a small group of women toward a temple district, seeking sanctuary among sacred altars. Soldiers dragged them out. She lost sight of her husband in the chaos. Her jewelry was stripped. A magistrate in the victorious camp declared the capture legitimate spoils. Marcia, like others, was taken to the general's tent for processing. In the tent, the ritual unfolded. An inventory was taken. Her braided hair was unplaited and restrained in a plain wrap. A wax tag bearing a short label was tied to her wrist, an administrative act that sealed a legal status. The commander, surrounded by officers who witnessed the act, assigned her to a senior centurion who needed domestic help. The designation was shorthand. The tag rendered her manageable, portable, a traceable asset should the commander choose to sell or reassign her. Any claim she had to property, dowry, or familial protection dissolved in administrative language. Her life in the centurion's tent became a series of constraints. She rose before dawn to fetch water. She wove while maternal women watched the children. She prepared simple meals for soldiers returning from patrols. Sexual requests came at unpredictable times. The centurion's wife, pragmatic and resentful, often tasked Marcia with tasks designed to remind her of inferiority. Sleeping on a mat in the scullery, being called to clean the latrine, being publicly corrected for imagined slights. Yet Marcia learned to maneuver. She ingratiated herself with a cook who favored the underdogs. She befriended a laundress with connections to a sympathetic mule driver. She kept a small clay token with her father's name beneath her mattress. When winter encamped the army and the days grew short, a rumor circulated that the commander intended to hold a selection of the captives for display at an upcoming triumph. Panic ran through the tents. For Marcia, the prospect of being paraded, exposed to the public gaze, sold if not chosen, meant a possible final erasure. The risk was no longer only personal humiliation. It was the destruction of any hope of restoration to her previous social world. One night, aided by others, she slipped a note, a tiny strip of parchment with a single name and a place, into the pocket of a visiting trader, someone known to move between camps and markets. The trader was an intermediary, a conduit to kin networks that had survived elsewhere. The note was a gamble. If intercepted, it could result in punishment. If delivered, it might begin a chain of petitions. Weeks later, a relative of Marcia in a neighboring district appeared at a magistrate's office, brandishing the paper as proof of her continued existence. The magistrate's bureaucracy moved slowly, but the petition was recorded. A request was made for inquiry. The campaign that had turned Marcia into a category had not entirely severed ties. Marcia never returned to her city. The petition produced a mixed result. The family was granted a partial restitution, a small sum, and the recognition of kinship that allowed for some ceremony in absentia. But Marcia remained within the camp's orbit. Her child, born there later, bore a name that mixed both worlds but was legally entangled. When she finally died, whether of illness exacerbated by poor conditions or of heartbreak made manifest, is indefinido. Her burial was modest, a few sherds and a simple marker at the edge of a camp cemetery. The public triumph that later celebrated the same campaign did not record her name. What survives from Marcia's life are the administrative notes in a ledger, a shard with a faint incised mark that might have been hers, and a petition recorded in a municipal file. These fragments speak more to the scale and machinery of domination than to the long arc of anyone's soul, but they carry weight because they are not unique. They echo across accounts, cite petitions, camp ledgers, archaeological finds, indefinido specifics. Marcia's story encapsulates the cruelty in the quiet acts. The tense ritual decision, the assignment that changed a life, was the hinge upon which many faiths swung. Yet within those constraints, human beings kept making choices that preserved memory and asserted personhood. Death and erasure completed the apparatus of silence. When captives died within camp households, they could be buried at the margins, in makeshift graves that left no public commemoration. Even burial practices could be used to obscure identity. Corpses buried without markers, or with markers later disturbed. When death occurred during a campaign, the record often reduced the person to a line item, casualties or losses, without the proper name that would anchor historical memory. This erasure continued into archives, where victors' records prioritized territorial and military achievements over the full human cost. Site, burial archaeology, campaign accounts, indefinido exact examples. Monuments of conquest are part of the problem. Triumphal arches, columns, and public inscriptions lauded victories and named generals. They rarely acknowledged those who were taken, raped, or sold. The rhetorical economy of victory traded silence for glory. This omission is not simply a modern ethical grievance, it is a historical phenomenon that shapes how subsequent generations understand the past. Commemoration that centers the triumph without grappling with the human cost perpetuates a partial memory, one that valorizes conquest and marginalizes suffering. Recovering these stories requires a deliberate inversion of focus. Historians and archaeologists have done this by turning to the margins. The legal petitions of families seeking restitution, grave goods that contradict official narratives, graffiti and inscriptions that assert presence, and comparative studies that reveal continuity in patterns of domination across regions and centuries. Some scholars have mapped the legal frameworks that allowed commanders discretion over captives. Others have traced the economic logic that made captives both useful and exchangeable. Still others have sought to read between the lines of classical authors, to find the voices of those otherwise silenced. These methodological efforts are not neutral. They are acts of moral recovery, attempts to reinsert human lived experience into narratives that have long prioritized institutions and leaders. Cite modern scholarship, archaeological syntheses, indefinido specifics. At times, the record yields unexpected compassion or critique. Philosophers and moralists of antiquity occasionally criticized the excesses of commanders or the moral cost of conquest. These critiques suggest that contemporaries sometimes recognize the dissonance between martial glory and human suffering. Such voices are sparse but significant. They complicate the notion that all of Roman society unthinkingly accepted the abuse of captives. They are reminders that norms were contested and that ethical reflection was present even amid practices we now condemn. Citi, moral writings, indefinido for exact passages. We have been careful to mark uncertainty. Certain practices, head shaving as a routine for captives, for example, appear in some sources and in neighboring cultural contexts, but lack universal attestation across all Roman theaters. Thus, they must be labeled infinito when generalized. Other elements are better documented. The distribution of spoils, the use of captives in households, and the vocabulary in legal texts that treated persons as property are attested more reliably. Wherever a claim rests on sparse evidence, I have flagged it as such. Where the record is thicker, I have indicated likely sources for follow-up research. Citi, Livy, Polybius, Plutarch, Roman legal fragments, inscriptions, archaeological reports, indefinido flags to be expanded in production notes. Why insist on the particular setting of the tent? Because the tent compresses the public and the private, the ritual and the bureaucratic, the individual and the institutional. It is an emblem of where conquest was converted into everyday control. The tent is not merely canvas. It is a node in a system, a place where words and acts made legal statuses, where the materiality of inventory met the moral reality of suffering. Returning to our opening image, the tent's flap did more than close on a person. It closed on a narrative that would struggle to reassert itself in the official memory. What responsibility do we have now as viewers, readers, citizens of the present? One answer is historiographical. To read monuments and official records critically, to ask what and who is omitted. A second answer is ethical. To name what was done and to insist that victims be part of historical memory. That does not mean reducing the past to a list of crimes. It means balancing recognition of political and military developments with attention to human consequences. There are modern parallels in the way institutions sometimes use legal or ritual language to obscure abuses. Bureaucracies that sanitize the categorization of people, systems that normalize violence under euphemism. Drawing parallels is not to equate complex modern realities with ancient ones, but to recognize continuities in how power can be exercised through language, ritual, and law. Such reflections help us to see why historical memory matters. When the mechanisms by which institutions convert people into categories go unnamed, they are easier to reproduce. Remembering is a corrective. It is an act of historical justice that seeks to restore presence to those who are made absent. This can take many forms: scholarship that centers victims' experiences, museum exhibits that include the stories of captives, commemorations that acknowledge the cost of victory, and public conversations that refuse to let silence stand as an acceptable legacy. Recovering names where possible, preserving vulnerable artifacts like shards with carved initials, and maintaining rigorous sourcing when reconstructing practices are all part of responsible remembrance. I close where we began, inside the tent, with the necklace on the ground and the commander pronouncing a new name. That moment is utterly repulsive because it crystallizes a larger system, one that made conquest a source not only of land and riches, but of human dispossession. The tent's small ceremony was a microcosm of how institutions convert victory into property and erase persons. But even within that apparatus, human beings resisted in ways both subtle and profound, by carving initials on broken pots, by singing forbidden songs, by sending dangerous notes through traders, and by maintaining the memory of names. Those acts of remembrance matter because they insist that history attend to the vulnerable. When we walk among arches and columns, when we admire the architectural horizon of a civilization, we should also ask whose stories have been muted in the construction of that beauty. To remember is not to condemn an entire past without nuance. It is to demand fullness in our understanding. If this account has moved you, share it and leave your thoughts. How shall we remember the victims of conquest? Your reflections are part of the work of recovery. Source placeholders for production research: Livy, Polybius, Plutarch. Roman legal fragments, e.g. fragments of jurists. Inscriptions and funerary epigraphy evidencing mixed parentage and petitions. Archaeological reports on military camps and domestic quarters. Studies on concubinage and household slavery. Modern scholarship on war captives and social memory. Indefinido where specified.